Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss various types of STEMI, that is ST segment elevated myocardial infarction. If you want to know why there is a ST segment elevation in MI, please refer to my earlier video on ST segment elevation and depression. This video will be about the types of ST segment elevation, anterior, inferior, lateral and posterior. More specifically, why they are named so, which artery is the culprit artery in each one of them, and which ECGs will show this ST segment elevation in these types. So to answer these questions, we are going to learn about the cardiac surface and borders, ECG leads types, and the coronary artery branches. Let's start with the basics of cardiac surfaces and borders. Heart has 5 surfaces, 4 borders, and 2 sulci or grooves. So this is the coronal sulcus, and this is the interventricular sulcus. The coronal sulcus separates atrium and the ventricles, and the true ventricle are separated by the interventricular sulcus. The anterior surface of the heart is mainly formed by the right ventricle and also contribution from the left ventricle and the right atrium. And the right border and the right surface by the right atrium, the left border and the left surface by the left ventricle, and the inferior border by both the ventricles. Superior surface by both the atrium and the great vessels. The posterior surface mainly formed by the left atrium. So though this is the general description of the entire heart, when it comes to STEMI, we mainly focus only on the left ventricular walls. That is, when we say anterior, posterior, lateral and inferior, we refer to the walls of the left ventricle itself and not the entire heart, mainly because in ST segment elevation MI, it's mainly due to left ventricle. That's one issue, and atrial infarctions are not going to be seen in the ST segment elevation. It's going to be picked up from the atrial ST segment, also called as STA, which actually falls in the PR segment. So when we look in the ST segment, it's only the ventricular infarction. That too, mainly the left ventricle infarction is seen. The right ventricle infarction is picked up by a separate set of leads, not the conventional 12 ECG leads. There are separate leads which will pick up the right ventricular involvement. So the left ventricular involvement, which is more common and more serious, are detailedly studied in the conventional 12 lead ECG. So this anterior, posterior, lateral and inferior, all the walls of the left ventricle when it comes to STEMI. So let's go into the ECG leads and find out where these 4 types of STEMI will be seen. Anterior, posterior, lateral and the inferior. Let's start with the inferior. These are the inferior leads, the 3 limb leads and the 2, 3 and AVF. This picks up the ST segment elevation in the inferior MI. This is inferior MI is very common. It's almost about 50% of all STEMI are due to inferior MI, which is actually due to right coronary artery involvement. We will see that in next slides. So this is inferior, and these two, AVL and 1, and along with the chest leads V5 and V6, they represent the lateral leads. So whenever there is a lateral MI, this AVL 1 and V5 and V6 will show ST segment elevation. And this is anterior. Anterior MI will be mainly seen in V3 and V4. These are called as anterior chest leads. The V5, V6 are lateral, and this is anterior, and V1, V2 is the septal. If it is a pure anterior infarction, then V3 and V4 will show the ST segment elevation. But most common type is anteroseptal, that is both V1 and V2, V3, V4 all will show the ST segment elevation, which shows the involvement of the septum, interventricular septum also. And the only one missing now so far is the AVR, which is sometimes referred as a neglected lead. It actually picks up an infarction from a region called as basal interventricular septum. This is present over here, basal interventricular septum. This septum, if there is a infarction, the ST segment elevation will be specifically seen in AVR. So this covers all the precordial leads. Now you might have noticed we have not covered this posterior and also not covered any right ventricular involvement. So far we have seen only the left ventricular types and which leads will show the changes. The right ventricular infarction, if we have to pick up, then we have to go into right ventricular chest leads, which are labeled as V3R, V4R and so on. It goes up to V6R. So these right sided chest leads will pick up the right ventricular ST segment elevation. Sometimes V1 also might show, but more specific is the right sided leads. And finally, if you have to find out the posterior myocardial infarction, the leads which are used are V7 to V9. These are called as posterior chest leads, which are actually placed on the posterior side of the thorax, which will pick up the ST segment elevation in posterior type. So anterior is the chest leads mainly, posterior is the posterior chest leads, lateral by both chest leads and the two limb leads 1 and AVL, inferior by the limb leads 2, 3 and AVF. This is where the ST segment elevation will be found in these types. Now let's go to the coronary arteries and which branch, if it gets blocked, which type of MI will come. That's what we are going to see now. Let's start with the right coronary artery. Right coronary artery originates from the aorta and comes down in the coronal sulcus, and then it goes to the posterior side and it gives off an important branch called as posterior descending artery. This is the PDA, posterior descending artery. And this right ventricle and the right atrium both are supplied by this right coronary artery. So in broad principle, the right heart is by the right coronary artery and the left heart is by the left coronary artery. But this PDA, which is special, which also supplies this left ventricle, inferior part of the left ventricle and the septal region, in 80% of the cases it comes from the right coronary artery. So it is said to be right dominant circulation. If this branch comes from left circumflex, which is a branch of left coronary artery, then it is said to be left dominant circulation. This PDA, posterior descending artery, if it is involved in myocardial infarction, since it supplies the inferior left ventricle and the septal region, we are going to get a inferior myocardial infarction where the 2, 3 and AVF leads will show ST segment elevation. And if the blockage is more proximal, then we are going to develop more and more symptoms like right ventricular will also be involved. That is because of this artery, acute marginal artery, which is given off by the right coronary artery before turning to the posterior side. This acute marginal artery responsible for most of the supply of the entire right ventricle. So if it is also involved, we are going to have a right ventricular involvement, which can be picked up by pacing the right sided leads V3R and V4 and so on. Sometimes V1 may also show ST segment elevation in a right ventricular involvement. And since some of the posterior surface of the ventricle, both right and left, is supplied by this right coronary artery, sometimes there could be a posterior MI also along with this inferior. In such cases, the posterior leads V7, V8 and V9 should be looked for ST segment elevation, and V1, V2, V3 may show up the ST segment depression in a posterior MI. So the elevation will be found only in the posterior chest leads. So this is the story of right coronary artery. Now let's see the left coronary artery. The left coronary artery is short. The main stem, it's called as left main stem or left main coronary artery. This is the name for it. This is very short and it immediately divides into two, that is left circumflex. This is the left circumflex, and it goes to the posterior side and it supplies the left atrium and parts of the left ventricle, and sometimes in 20% of the cases it gives off the posterior descending artery. And the other branch of the left mainstem is the left anterior descending artery, which supplies the anterior region of the left ventricle and some of the lateral region also. So anterior and left of the left ventricle, the most important parts are supplied by the left anterior descending artery. If it is involved, the mortality rate is very high. So sometimes this is called as the widowmaker artery, the left anterior descending artery. It also gives off septal branch which supplies the basal interventricular septum. The first septal branch supplies the basal interventricular septum, and the rest of the anterior septum is supplied by this other septal branches of the left anterior descending artery. So as we have seen in the previous slide, that is infarction in the basal septum will lead to changes in the AVR. So if AVR shows ST segment elevation, so people suspect that there is a proximal lesion in the left anterior descending artery, that is even before giving the branch of septal artery. If there is no ST segment elevation in AVR, then the lesion is below the septal branch. And it also gives apical branch and also gives diagonal branches which supplies the lateral wall. The first diagonal branch supplies the high lateral side. The other diagonal branches supplies the lateral part of the other regions in the left ventricle. This left circumflex artery not only supplies the posterior region, it also gives off a branch called as obtuse marginal artery which supplies the lateral surface of the left ventricle. So now when the left anterior descending artery is infarcted, the type of infarction the person develops is anterior MI. If only anterior, if it is lower down, if it's a distal, then only V3, V4 will show ST segment elevation. If the septal artery is also involved, then V1, V2 also might show ST segment elevation. If the lateral diagonal branches are also blocked, then the person will develop V5, V6 will also show the entire chest leads will show ST segment elevation. So this is pure anterior, and these two are involved, it's called as anterior septal. And if these two are involved, then it's called as anterior lateral. Sometimes along with these chest leads, the lateral leads 1 and AVL also will show a ST segment elevation. This is called as extensive anterior myocardial infarction, which carries a high mortality risk. So this is the left anterior descending story. Next is the left circumflex. The left circumflex, if it is blocked, it's going to develop a posterior myocardial infarction, which can be picked up by the leads of the V7, V8 and V9, the posterior leads. If it is distal, if it is a proximal LCX infection, infarction, then the lateral wall also of the left ventricle also involved because of this obtuse marginal artery. So the person develops both lateral and posterior myocardial infarction. So this is the lateral type. If lateral plus posterior, then it is probably LCX. As we have seen in 20% of the cases, the left coronary artery is dominant, which also gives the interventricular, the posterior interventricular artery or the posterior descending artery, which supplies the inferior left ventricular also. So if a person has a left coronary artery dominant, left dominant circulation and a left circumflex occlusion, the person will develop posterior plus lateral plus inferior type of myocardial infarction. All these three types of leads will show an ST segment elevation. Now the thing is, then final thing is that isolated lateral infarction could be due to one of the branches, like if just the obtuse marginal artery or one of these diagonal branches of the left anterior is alone involved, then there will be only lateral infarction without any anterior or posterior. So lateral isolated is due to these branches, either the diagonal branch or obtuse marginal artery. Lateral plus posterior is left circumflex. If lateral plus anterior, it could be due to the left anterior descending artery. So this is the arteries and the types of myocardial infarction. Let's do a quick revision with reference to the types and which area it involves and which leads it will show. So this is inferior MI. This involves the inferior wall of the inferior wall of the left ventricle. So this is the zone which is involved, the inferior wall of the left ventricle. It is mainly due to right coronary artery. This is mainly due to a right coronary artery involvement. And in case of left dominant circulation, the same thing could happen also due to a left circumflex artery occlusion. Anterior is due to anterior left ventricle is infarcted due to occlusion of the left descending artery, left anterior descending artery, LAD, which if it is distal, only anterior will be involved. If it is more proximal, anterior septal will also be involved. This will be picked up by V1 and V2. This is V3 and V4. And anterior lateral will also plus it involve V5 and V6. And if it also has one and AVL ST segment elevation, which is called as extensive anterior, which will involve the V1, V2, V3, V4, the entire region of the left ventricle is undergone infarction. This is most probably due to a left descending artery, left anterior descending artery proximal lesion. Isolated lateral we have already seen, which happens due to only the blockage of the obtuse marginal artery or a diagonal branch which is coming. The diagonal branch supplies the lateral region also. This is diagonal artery 1, the first diagonal artery. If it is alone involved, which is a branch of left descending artery, it gives off this high lateral myocardial infarction, which where there is only lead 1 and lead AVL will show ST segment elevation. This is called as high lateral due to diagonal artery 1. Posterior and lateral, it is due to the left circumflex artery. And if it is a proximal lesion, which will show both posterior and lateral. If it's a distal lesion of left circumflex, there will be only posterior type of myocardial infarction, which will be seen in V7, V8. Right ventricular infarction is definitely due to right coronary artery, which will be picked up by the right sided chest leads. And that's it. We have covered all the types and all the arteries and where we will see the ECG leads. So I have given a list of all this culprit vessel and what type of ST segment elevation the person will get. Just please go through it. And if you understood, please like, share and comment. Please subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, leave it in the comment. I will use them as ideas for my new videos, or if you have any idea, please put it as a request. I will make new videos on those topics. Thank you.